Hello and welcome to the Theology Mill podcast brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I work here at Whitfinstock and I'm the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. So on this episode, I speak with Dr. Paul Louis Metzger about the second edition of his book, which is entitled Evangelical Zen, A Christian's Spiritual Travels with a Buddhist Friend. Paul is professor of Christian theology and culture at Multnomah Biblical Seminary, Jessup University. He's also the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins. And in addition to this book on Evangelical Zen, he is also the author and editor of a number of books, including books entitled More Than Things, A Personalist Ethics for a Throwaway Culture, another called Connecting Christ, How to Discuss Jesus in a World of Diverse Paths, and then as co-editor of a book entitled A World for All, Global Civil Society in Political Theory and Trinitarian Theology. So with that, we'll hop over to the interview now. Thank you so much for listening. I do hope you enjoy this episode. So I'm joined today by Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, who is the author of the now second edition of his book, Evangelical Zen, A Christian Spiritual Travels with a Buddhist Friend, which published with our Cascade imprint recently. So Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. I know we've been trying to get together for quite a while, so I'm very glad that we were able to make it work and to meet in this way online. As we kind of kick things off, could you maybe share with our listeners a bit about yourself, maybe where you work and sort of the areas that you research and write in?
Thank you, Zach, and it's great to be with you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time, so many thanks for your patience as we've been trying to put this together. But so Paul Louis Metzger, and I married with wife of 30, what is it now? 35 years.
Wow. Well done.
This August, Mariko, and we have two children, granddaughter, and also a Shiba Inu. so, and professor of Christian theology and theology of culture at Multnomah Biblical Seminary, Jessup University. So I work in Portland, Oregon, and I direct the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and I write a lot. So I write Evangelical Zen, recently More Than Things with IVP Academic, Personalist Ethics for a Throwaway Culture. My first book was on Karl Barth for Eerdmans, The Word of Christ in the World of Culture, Sacred and Secular through the Theology of Karl Barth. So just various books on matters of theology, theology of culture, ethics, philosophy, etc. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Okay, this is a question that I always ask everybody who comes on. I don't know if you've listened to any of the episodes. It's okay if you haven't. But one question I ask all of our guests to kind of start things off is if you could place any three thinkers, and they can be dead or alive, together in a room and listen into their conversation, which three people would you choose and why? And if you want, I know we're going to talk about your late friend Kyogen. If you want to include him in the table and then add three more, you're welcome to do so. I'll let you kind of run with it however you want to.
Okay, well, thanks, Zach. And I hope I'm not going too far beyond the boundaries, but given the nature of the book uh, that we're going to be discussing, Evangelical Zen, A Christian Spiritual Travels with a Buddhist Friend, I had four listed here in addition to
That's
Kyogen, but
okay. That's
you can
okay.
always cut one out. But, I talk about it's really a hybrid between Augustine's Confessions and Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And so I'd say St. Augustine, because of the Confessions and his approach to spirituality, because this book really is confessions. He was, of course, dealing with Neoplatonism, not Zen Buddhism. He was dealing with a variety of traditions, but the confessional nature of that work, namely the Confessions. And City of God would be another one that comes to my mind. Dogen, the great Buddhist thinker who was key to the shaping of Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, in particular in Japan, way back when. And then I'm only supposed to have one besides Kyogen, Zen Buddhist priest, but I have to say MLK because of his whole emphasis building on Royce's statement of the beloved community, which
Mm.
was always central to Kyogen's in my thought, and John Steinbeck because he always saw the whole of reality, so to speak, in the context in which he was writing about. So, like East of Eden, it all takes place in Salinas, California, where he's from. This grand meta narrative of Scripture. So that also plays into the book Evangelical Zen. So to have them all together to listen to them would be phenomenal. So sorry
Mhm.
for cheating and adding one more.
That's all right. The more the merrier. Okay, so first question is, how did this book even come into being? And then, kind of in tandem with that, what sort of prompted your interest at first in Zen Buddhism, and then in Japanese culture more generally? Because this book obviously is about Zen in a way, but you also are engaging with just sort of Japanese culture more broadly. So, could you say a little bit about kind of what prompted your interest in those and how this book kind of first came into being?
Yeah. So as far as Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, for example, I'll go back to Pirsig. I read that book in college, and it had a significant impact on me. I just always found it fascinating how he would gauge the meaning of life. I think it was with his son on their cross country motorcycle trip, and he would reflect upon key questions of life while doing motorcycle maintenance. And there's a sense in which the process and the journey itself was as, if not more important, as the destination and the finished product, so to speak. And that always stood out to me, the process, not just the product. And the journey itself needs to be accounted for, because I think I so often drive somewhere thinking only about the destination and not the journey itself. And so this book itself is about a journey. And I
Mhm.
recall even one of the endorsers, J. Kieran Sebastian, Professor Sebastian, saying this in terms of his reflection and endorsement of the book, where he says that all of us must come to recognize that the journey itself is the goal. We'll be better off by using it as an active roadmap. So, that idea of the journey itself is the goal is
Mhm.
something that I've encountered in a variety of ways in engaging Buddhism, and of course a vast array of other thought forms, including Christian faith. So that's an aspect of it as it relates to Buddhism. Before I ever met Kyogen, and we worked together here in Portland, Oregon, New Wine, New Wineskins, students of mine, others in our community connected to Multnomah would meet with members of Dharma Rain Zen Center. Kyogen and I would oversee potlucks and discussions for many years. And so we would get together at one another's facilities month in, month out. And so before we ever did that, though, my wife and I lived in Japan, and I interacted with a lot of different Buddhist thinkers and studied with the Buddhist priest, but that was at the Tendai school at Zen Koji in Nagano City.
Mhm.
And so coming to Portland after that, I was really alert to the opportunity to engage people with diverse backgrounds, including Buddhists. And then Kyogen and I met. So the book itself arose from a time when my family and I were staying in Japan. I decided to write reflections during our time there. Uh, I can't say exactly when, but we've been there many times and
Mhm.
stayed for various durations. But I started to write a 40-day collection of my reflections that not just dealt with those days, but also accounted for our time together over the years there and other reflections. And then I asked Kyogen, would he be willing to engage with me as I was crafting those essays and respond to them, write the forward to them. So it really had an evolution where I started and I asked Kyogen, would he be willing to engage? And then had the opportunity to publish it with Pathos, the first edition, and then spoke to our friends at Cascade who accepted it for a second edition. So hope that makes some sense, Zach. It's had a
Yeah.
bit of a multifaceted journey.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for that. Okay, so I want to talk about the title of the book. Obviously, we've both mentioned is Evangelical Zen. So first, one question I have is what would you say makes this book evangelical? And then in addition to that, where kind of in your mind do the evangelical and the Zen parts of the title or parts of the book, where do those sort of meet in this
Well,
book?
yeah, thank you, Zach. So, I mean, for one, I'm an evangelical, and Kyogen is a Zen Buddhist. So
Hmm.
there's
Hmm.
that aspect to it that is what makes it definitively evangelical Zen. So I write as an evangelical in terms of my spirituality, not necessarily all the connotations associated with evangelical Christianity, but I am an evangelical, and so the confessional nature of my faith, the devotional nature of my faith comes into play there. And Kyogen as a Zen priest is engaging me from that vantage point. So it's not that I deal at great length with Zen Buddhism in the book, other than I'm dealing with Kyogen definitively.
Hmm.
There are
Hmm.
other traditions that I engage, Jodo Shinshu, etc., more per se than I do Zen, but there's certainly overlap amongst them, like on the doctrine of impermanence that comes into play there. So
Hmm.
uh, but it's really Kyogen and me. It's our journey of dialogue, of discussion around these 40 days of purpose, shall we say, of this spiritual travelogue in Japan. So that's a key aspect to
Hmm.
what's going on there. I'm often asked, Zach, this question of like, how is this book both evangelical and Zen? And one of the things I get at in the second edition, in part to answer that question, is this following paragraph. While Kyogen is the only direct connection to Zen in the first edition, indirect connections permeate the landscape of the spiritual travelogue. Take, for example, Zen's analysis of non duality and duality. Speaking analogically, Kyogen and I are neither entirely unified, nor are we entirely distinct from one another. Ours is a third way forward, reflective of Zen generally, not one and not two, neither non dualism nor dualism, neither a fusion of the two traditions nor a separation of the two. Rather, a third way opens between or beyond them, evangelical Zen. Sally Gico Tisdale in her afterword gets at a similar point because she says, Paul writes, those with big pockets can live with difficult questions. They can live with doubt and confusion and paradox. And she's quoting me here, where I say, those who receive life as a gift with open hands, rather than seize it as something one deserves, have more room in their pockets to hold life's questions and to fill their pockets with life's unexpected answers that find them along the way, unquote, from what I write earlier. She says, these big pockets are a natural side effect of Zen practice. We cultivate spaciousness within ourselves, room for all the seeming paradoxes and complications of ordinary life. We find in that spaciousness what is beyond paradox, what is beyond opposition. He, namely, she's talking about me, always laughs and nods when she says, more than once I have told Paul that he is actually a Buddhist. One of Paul's qualities is his willingness to live with ambiguity within a doctrine that is often unkind to such an attitude. This expression, or this book, is an expression of the third position, which I had talked about earlier, the place where one can't take sides because there are no sides. That quality is bound up with the book in a key way, even in the midst of the tensions. And then, she says this in Paul, Kyogen found a friend with an open heart. Here was a friend outside his usual circles with whom he could drop the constructions of rank and the demands of being the leader of a growing Zen community. Kyogen admired Paul's commitment and sincerity. He loved Paul, but most of all, he liked him. In Kyogen, Paul found a friend of another path. Kyogen accepted Paul and reflected on his spiritual life without belittling or mocking it. Here was a friend who had more curiosity than judgment, more questions than answers. Their friendship showed how porous the boundaries between us are. It was a place without enemies. And this book was, as she says, and we were saying, about that third way. So I hope that's a bit helpful in terms of getting at a sense of the book and of the
Mm-hmm.
friendship between Kyogen and me, because it really is a book about our friendship in many respects in the midst of this spiritual travelogue in Japan.
So yeah, what one of you just mentioned it, but one of the tensions that I noticed kind of comes up in the book, or at least a significant difference, a major difference that kind of comes up between Christianity and Buddhism, is this emphasis on permanence, right, which is a crucial part of Christianity, and then impermanence in Buddhism. So how would you maybe describe this kind of particular difference between the two religions? And then also, I'm wondering if that ever came up in your dialogues with the Zen Buddhist community that you've been in close contact with, that you've spoken about a bit already.
Yes, we discussed at our various potlucks points of tension. We didn't go around our differences, but we would engage one another through our differences. And for some, that might be counterintuitive. A lot of times in interfaith discourse, it's finding the commonalities and building on those, and there's a place for that. But Kyogen and I first met in a discussion around tensions between minority community and the police department in Portland. We were both part of a discussion group bringing together religious leaders, police officials, others, again, minority populations, to discuss our grievances, our concerns. And the moderator of our particular group wanted us to leave our particular traditions, convictions at the door. And Kyogen and I thought, well, that we need to bring our traditions into the discussion because
Mhm.
they orient us. And so after that time, Kyogen reached out to me because of the culture wars that were really coming to a head around the elections in 2004 and the like. So this goes back quite some time, and asked me to come and speak at Dharma Rain Zen Center sometime after the 2004 presidential election and the like. And it was really striking how we once again engaged, always going through our convictions rather than around, not stopping short. So Jesus and Buddha, permanence and impermanence, a variety of other issues would arise in the discussions. We didn't hide from them. We wanted to
Mhm.
press into them so that we could really come to understand one another in our distinctiveness. So we've called it multi-faith engagement, not interfaith. And so permanence and impermanence, for Orthodox Christianity, the soul, the person has permanence. Historically, there would be this sense of we will be raised immortal. From the understanding of Scripture, raised immortal for all time, and even presently, we have eternal souls wed to bodies. We could talk about, okay, well, what about the dissolution of the body with death, and what does that mean for the soul, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just speaking permanence is a key historic Orthodox Christian theme, whereas for Buddhists, Zen Buddhists in particular, the theme of impermanence is very significant. That the self is not permanent. It could be seen as aggregates. We perceive the soul perhaps to be permanent, but really that's not accurate. That there is this sense in which we are not enduring selves. So, of course, that was a key point of tension in our discussions. It wasn't that it led to violent rhetoric or anything like that, but it was
Mhm.
like a point of where things would come to a standstill in terms of, okay, we're trying to understand one another, but for both traditions, that's a significant point of tension. So
Mhm.
that's what I'd want to say to that at this juncture.
Mhm. Yeah. Another thing that you talk about in the book, I really liked this a little story that you share. So you share this story in which your wife spoke of Westerners as having small pockets, she said, and then you go on to kind of share what you see as the value of living with big pockets rather than small pockets. So I'm wondering, maybe for our listeners, what if you could share a little bit what you mean by this? What is this small pockets and big pockets? And then what have you learned from Buddhism or Japanese culture more generally about living with quote unquote big pockets?
Right. So, thank you. When my wife made that point to me, I was really struggling with questions about direction in life. We were living in Japan at the time, and like, why did this happen? Why didn't this happen? How did things turn out this way? And she really encouraged me, even exhorted me to live in the tension more, to live with the questions, not to have to come to some definitive answer on some of the complexities and the perplexities that we were
Mm,
enduring. And I just appreciated so much that exhortation, because I think learning to live with ambiguity, learning to live in liminal spaces in this no man's land, so to speak, in between, is really important because life often is very fuzzy. It doesn't mean we can't have definitive answers, but I think it's learning to live with tension more. And in many ways, I do, but in certain areas of my life, uh, at the time and even now, it was hard. It is hard. And so I think
mm,
learning to live with an open hand, I often like to think of that, with palms joined, is something that Kyogen would say. And I think, in Buddhism and Zen included, there's this emphasis on non grasping. And I've always found that really striking. And
mm,
so I think learning to live with an open hand to life, not having to sum it all up and to seize it and to seek to control it, but to follow the questions, to keep opening oneself up to the mystery of life, and allowing it to unfold in front of one rather than to have to seize and conquer, is in part what that discussion led me to. So it started with just our own life journey and career call at the time, as we were living in Japan, not sure of what the future would hold. And she just really encouraged me to embrace the journey. And it was very practical help. And then Kyogen and I, we built on that. And he resonated with that, of course, because in his tradition, there is much place for living within that ambiguity and
mm,
with, again, an open hand. So that's where that all emerged and what it's led to, even over the years, on how to embrace that for the sake of experiencing a more meaningful life, where,
mm.
again, one doesn't have to always seek to be in control of the answers of the story, but to really sense life as truly an open mystery, one that is opening up before one's eyes.
Mm. Yeah. I'm curious, in your relationship with Kyogen and your relationship with the Zen Buddhist community here in Portland, as you were kind of being confronted by challenges of, a different kind of coming into contact with a different religion, maybe grappling with, you know, your own propensity towards having small pockets rather than big pockets or something like that. I'm curious if that caused you to kind of go back deeper into your own faith, or if that more so drove you to learn more about Buddhism, or if it was a little bit of both.
Yeah, so I would say it was a combination. I think that the way I look at multi faith engagement, I don't look at things as hermetically sealed envelopes,
Mhm,
so that
mhm,
uh, as I am writing elsewhere for a book, and I'm not the first to mention this, but there's a sense of holy envy. I see profound qualities, trajectories in a variety of traditions, including Zen Buddhism. I don't take that in a syncretistic way, but I think that there is a sense in which I can really admire a tradition. And so the non-grasping, even though I don't believe in impermanence of the soul or the person,
Hmm. Hmm.
I still think there is something to be learned about the non-grasping self that, and I take that up in my own particular Christian way, and I alluded to that just briefly. But so a holy envy, and Krista Stendhal had talked about that many years earlier, and others have picked up on that. But I think there's also a sense of holy jealousy that I write about, that and it's part of a book project I'm developing for IVP Academic, and that we will also come to appreciate more what our tradition stands for and why we prize or cherish certain values in our tradition. And so a holy jealousy,
Hmm.
there are forms of jealousy that are not good, and there are
Yeah.
forms of envy that aren't good. And so I'm talking about holy envy and holy jealousy. And so, to me, the permanence of the soul is something that I really prize and I cherish, and the permanence of the person, that we are enduring selves. And so the conversations will show to me something that I could easily discount. And I think, wow, there is something to this. And I wonder, when people don't see the permanence of the self, and they miss someone, I feel like, well, perhaps that missing and that longing is bound up with that we are wired to see one another as eternal, to riff off of C.S. Lewis, the weight of glory, that we are immortal beings, that I think is placed within our souls. We're wired in that way. And so I cherish my tradition. I also can admire others. So it's an ongoing dialogue, not of
Hmm.
syncretism, but of true synergy, and again, more like jazz than it is, something like a Baroque orchestra piece.
Hmm. Hmm. Sure. Yeah. No, thank you for that clarification. So I know one important thread in your friendship with Kyogen, and one is something that comes through really clearly in the book was kind of your shared grappling with America's culture wars, right? Which you've talked a bit about already, right? And then the role of kind of religion within those culture wars. So, what would you say Buddhism has kind of taught you, or what have you learned from Buddhism with respect to this kind of ideological warfaring that we have been seeing in America? You talked about back in 2004. Obviously, it's just as heated, if not more so, today. So what have you learned from Buddhism with respect to kind of these cultural goings on that you're seeing in our country?
Yeah, so I've always found in Kyogen someone who would guard against faulty judgments of others. He really tried to take the individual before him on their own terms, and in that
Mhm.
moment of conversation, never to try and project and presume, but really see them. And I think that was part of his tradition, always to live in this moment, to deal with what is right before oneself, including how one is experiencing, processing, even one's perceptions, but also to really try to account for the other. And so I've watched how Kyogen would challenge people in his own community not to project or to operate, and we can all be this way, self-righteous, to play off Jonathan Haidt's language
Mhm.
of the
Mhm.
moral, the righteous mind, that he argues that we're all self-righteous. We think our way is the best way, and we have a hard time seeing that there can be good in the other. uh, I think Kyogen could have written that book too, because he would
Mhm.
always account for the fact that we don't see clearly, we make prejudgments, we make judgments of the other, and we don't deal with the struggles in our own selves that we need to account for. So that self-awareness, Socrates said the unexamined life was not worth living, and Kyogen lived a very worthwhile life. He examined how he would perceive others, and seek not to project. And I think we have this today and it doesn't mean all cats are gray and that there aren't moral judgments to make, but we first have to see one another carefully. And I loved how Sally Gico Tisdale, who was one of his students, who does the afterword for the second edition, she's a good friend and she's been a part of our conversations over the years. If I could quote from her afterward, Zach, I think it would be
Mhm.
helpful in this
Yeah,
regard.
absolutely.
she said, for example, I'm just going to read this one paragraph. It's on page 180. The most challenging conversations are the ones about our religious beliefs, the soul, impermanence, eternity, moral guidelines. None of these are easy to explain. Our paths are felt rather than defined. And she's talking about our dialogues, Zen Buddhists and evangelical Christians. It is in these talks that we are most opaque to each other. For me, this is also when I have to be most careful about critical judgment. Zen teaches a blunt insistence on seeing things as they are, not as we wish them to be or hope they will become. Zen tries to cure us of fantasies. Sometimes evangelical Christianity seems to be nothing but fantasy. I notice this reaction and find a place to file it. So, she's picking up on what her teacher, Kyogen, would have taught, that, okay, file it, make note of it, how you are, reacting in this way. And again, are we seeing people right before us as they are, not as we want to see them, would see them,
Mhm. Mhm.
etc. So I notice this reaction and find a place to file it. The idea that those of differing beliefs are our enemies is one reason people are driven away from that Christian community. I think few of the evangelicals grasp the harm that has been done in their churches. In our dialogues, they hear it, they see it, and many have apologized for it. The Buddhists are not always good at seeing how they contribute to division. So again, that self-examination, that was a key part of our discussions. I had seen him respond at one point to an individual in the evangelical Christian community who really was challenging in a very strong manner. And
Mhm.
how he addressed it was very firm, but also he didn't make judgments as if he could assume what was really going on with the person. He
Mhm.
just really tried to deal with the matter at hand and didn't take anything forward from it and make, you know, a final judgment of that person. I just found this so striking, how he would
Mhm.
challenge people, challenge himself, but always so that we could stay in the conversation to seek to see the other. And I just have rarely found that in someone, and I want to
Mhm.
learn from that. And I think it's a great help to us in the culture wars because we project onto others in hate or height, however you want to pronounce his name.
Mhm.
We'll talk about this. We tend to see ourselves, as I said earlier, as righteous and others as not righteous. And we don't realize we have these moral intuitions that shape us in our affections, shape our reason, and we don't see clear-eyed. We don't see as things really are, and we need to constantly examine and re-examine. And Kyogen was a great master of that. And while he would make judgments, I never felt judged in his presence. He was very inquisitive, not inquisitional, as I like to say. And I
Mhm.
think
Mhm.
we can learn that while certainly accounting for ethical perspectives and making and holding to strong convictions on the right and the left and everywhere in between, but to process and engage one another, to learn from one another, not to sum one another up and spit one another out, but to really try to see one another and engage one another. That requires hard work. And I don't think we have time for that. So often today, social media has its place, but I think so often it becomes antisocial. And part of that is we're just quick to draw conclusions and quick to make judgments of one another without really inhabiting shared space. And those potlucks that Kyogen initiated, I mean, he invited me to come and speak during that first go around with the culture
Mhm.
wars that were really coming to a head in Portland and elsewhere in the states, with President Bush winning re-election and certain social issues coming to the foreground. And he asked me to come and speak about compassion from a Christian vantage point, and to share stories, to share from Scripture to his community. So let's have a potluck where everyone brings a dish. And I thought that was such a profound way of engaging because, everyone brings a prized dish. Everyone comes as an equal to a table. It's not a platform, it's a table. And as you share a story, as you share a meal, some of the dividing walls come down. And as Sally Tisdale said in an article she wrote for Tricycle Magazine, years ago. She said, we found that these evangelicals were smarter than we thought. They found out we were
Mm-hmm.
funnier than they would have
Mm-hmm.
thought. And we realized that, oh, you like noodle salad? I like noodle salad too. It's like, how can they like the things we like? Are they human? I mean, the way we could look at one another from our respective traditions. And how silly that is, that we in a sense don't see one another as sharing our humanity. But it's been really profound working with our Zen
Mm-hmm.
Buddhist friends, because you come to realize the preconceptions, sometimes the faulty judgments that one is operating with, namely oneself, and to learn, really, we do share a lot of commonalities, while we have very strong differences at key moments.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's well said. So I want to maybe go back in time a couple centuries and then some now to a figure that you quote pretty frequently throughout the book. This 18th and 19th century Japanese haiku poet Kobayashi Issa, and help me out if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. But I
Yeah,
wonder if
Kobayashi
you
Issa.
okay,
Kobayashi
okay,
Issa is how I
okay,
pronounce it.
okay, perfect, okay.
Well,
So
let's
I
hope
wonder if
that's
you
right. Let's hope that's right. So,
Yeah. I wonder if you might say something about who he was and what influence his life and his poetry has kind of had on you personally.
yeah. So, as I mentioned in the book, he lived in Takayama Village in Nagano, Japan, and not far from where my wife was raised. And so, to me, living there in Nagano, Japan, not far from where he had lived, and also the great artist Hokusai lived, which was in Obase for a season of his life. I mean, it was just amazing, to be where
Mhm,
these two
mhm,
figures had lived in in different towns, but nonetheless. And so, he was a master haiku poet, and would write about his own personal life, his own emotional life. And there was a sense, and I talk about this, he lived with a broken and leaning heart. He had a warped heart, which is translated from the Japanese. There's a museum in his honor. It is shaped in such a way, and I write this in the book, that it leans, and it's a fascinating
mm,
museum structure, which is dedicated to him. It's almost like a tall hat that's been bent. And one
mm,
sign at the museum reads that the shape of the museum is intended to convey his warped heart, as I had said earlier.
mm,
And it's based on his experience in life, and his poetry was intended. I think that was pretty unique. His inner experiences, his true inner feelings, and so that's what I've always been struck by, this warped heart, or this leaning heart. And not that he was a warped person, but he lost his wife and his children. Uh, they were quite young when they passed, as I recall,
mm,
and he was inclined, as I write in the book, to express his true inner feelings through attention to animals and children and those in vulnerable positions in society. So, you know, I see him, and you might be struck by this, but I'm also struck by the great rock musician Kurt Cobain, because I think he also lived with a leaning heart. "Come as
mhm,
You Are," is a song that reflects some of that. A leaning heart, a heart, I believe, in the midst of his own pained soul, what, to use Augustine's language, is tortured soul, a
mhm,
beautiful human being who would reflect upon the needs of people that were often marginalized. And he himself was, in one sense, an insider in terms of his rock fame, but he was always, in a sense, an outsider. And so, I think that these figures like Cobain, and the lead singer of Nirvana, or Issa, were just really beautiful souls in my estimation. The inner person, the focus on the inner person, and an inclined heart. And I value that so much in Isa. And so, yeah, that's part of what I was dealing with. And,
mhm,
with the tragedy my family endured, my son, Christopher, who is 29 now, endured a catastrophic brain injury almost four
mhm,
years ago. January 21st will be the fourth anniversary. And of course, that's hit us extremely hard. We live with that daily, and he's minimally conscious now. He's married with a small child, or with an 8-year-old daughter. She's 8 now.
Mm.
Jayla is. And it's heavy for us. And, Sally Tisdale says in the afterword, Paul is bent, but we're all bent, so to speak. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think,
Mm-hmm.
she understands this about me, that, I'm not broken, I'm bent, but we're all
Mm-hmm.
bent. And I think that in Issa really helps me to find meaning in the midst of pain and suffering. And I think, as Kyogen says at one point, grief is important, and we need to account for our grief rather than try and sweep it under the carpet. And
Mm-hmm.
Issa processes it well, and I think helps us. And that's a real gift from this haiku poet to us today, to not hide our emotions, but to really express them, and hopefully to express them well in a meaningful manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We haven't talked that much actually yet about your time that you've spent in Japan. I mean, you did mention you've been there a number of times. You and your wife lived there for a time, and one of the instances that you write about of your time in Japan was your experience with this sort of some kind of nirvana moment that you had while you were. I might need help on the pronunciation on this as well, but while you were in
Nirvana and Kanazawa. Nirvana and Kanazawa.
Kanazawa. Okay, while
Yeah.
you were in Kanazawa. Okay, so could you say a little bit about what that experience was like, and then what about it kind of has led you in the book to describe it as kind of your own kind of nirvana in a way?
Thank you, Zach. So, in our 40 days, this one particular time in Japan, this particular trip, we visited Kanazawa, and there's this famous garden there, one of the great Japanese gardens. And I think it was around the time when my kids were, in a quiet space near a pond, or just at some other point in the garden or in the town. It just really struck me that, we could put away everything that would so often clutter my mind, or our minds. And, whether it was email or descriptions, titles, et cetera, et cetera. And just like all of that, I could put to the side and just live in that particular moment. And just that idea of being present, truly present, is so hard. Usually my mind is very cluttered, so many demands, so much calling for my attention. And I'm not the only one who goes through this. I think we
Mhm,
all
mhm,
have this struggle, some more than others. And my mind can race almost at breakneck speed internally.
mhm, yeah,
And I just was able to put it all to the side that particular day, as we were at the garden and in that town. And, as I write about in one of the other essays, just being there at a pool in the garden where my kids were looking at, I believe it was koi fish, and just we could just watch them and watch the fish and be present. So often we're thinking about what's ahead of us or what's behind us, getting distracted and not being in that moment. And again, I think Zen, in its own practice with Zazen, is really much about, being present, accounting for
mhm,
what one's thoughts are right then and there, and to try and be still, to still one's mind. And of course, there are Christian spiritual traditions that will emphasize being present and being mindful, a big theme for, Christians and Buddhists in various traditions. But Zen is really focused on that in its practice. And so that's why I was talking about Nirvana and Kanazawa, just, finding
mhm,
enlightenment in a Zen manner, if we use that language, between the moments, or in the moment, if you will, that sense of rest, of, shall we say, enlightenment. And so,
mhm,
I'm playing off that. I'm not trying to somehow come across as, being a Zen Buddhist. Sally Tisdale would say, Paul, you are a Buddhist, the way you think and such. And I always took that as, with great appreciation, that, she felt that there were commonalities, or that she's thought
mhm,
that. And like I reflect on it very much from my own Christian value system, but there is at times overlap in our shared human experience, and I'm grateful for
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
connection.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So one of the things that you and Kyogen both talk about in the book is kind of the merits of following a trail, as you describe it, following a trail from its head to its end. So kind of talking about religions as trails in this case. So kind of following from the head of the trail to the end of the trail, rather than sort of sampling several trails, several religions, or several traditions at maybe a more kind of shallow level. So, why would you say that this has been sort of the preferred route, or the route that both you and Kyogen have chosen for yourselves?
Yeah, so Leslie Newbegin talks about how in our consumer culture, we treat religion almost as if it's a brand of toothpaste or laundry detergent. I can't recall exactly the metaphors, but and it's like one brand over another, and not seeing religion as having its cohesive binding element in society anymore. And I think that kind of consumer conveyor belt kind of orientation to religion, just dealing with tastes, likings, surface appetites, is a real problem in many ways for really grasping and grappling with these various traditions. And so I think for Kyogen, very liberal person, but very much embedded in a tradition, did not want people to just kind of go through a smorgasbord and
Hmm.
taste this or taste that and kind of mix and match. A very serious practitioner. And I respected him for it greatly. And I'm also grateful that he respected me for taking seriously my tradition. That while I see the warts, the wrinkles, the problems within my evangelical tradition, hopefully, and hopefully I see my own, problematic aspects to my identity as an evangelical Christian. Nonetheless, I take seriously my tradition, and so I think that you know really going fully into it, inhabiting, following the trail down to its end, with all that's accounted for, with all the implications, being a serious practitioner, I found it really refreshing. Of course, there's a place for coexistence. There's a place for seeking to understand and uh, be tolerant of one another. None of that is to
Hmm.
be disparaged or jettisoned, but we still have to take very seriously that these are traditions with significant convictions that cannot be, in a sense, washed away or simply streamlined and looked upon not as nothing more than as brands of
Hmm.
toothpaste or laundry detergent, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, these have ultimate and transcendent values. And so I think there's something to be had. And, a lot of people, a lot of Americans will have a kind of fascination, infatuation with Zen Buddhism, but it's not because they've really inhabited it. Whereas for Kyogen and company, these are people who've often come from other traditions, but they take very seriously their practice. And I think it's a good exhortation to us as Christians to take very seriously our tradition and not simply treat it as a brand or a consumer
Hmm.
uh, product, if you will. So I hope that's in some respects answering the good question.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it is. Yeah, and I think that transitions nicely to my next question, because for all the differences, and for you talked about how the evangelical community that you're a part of, and the Zen community that you were in contact you are in close contact with, how it's more modeled on kind of a multi-faith engagement, right, rather than an interfaith engagement. but still, it does seem like from my reading of the book that there's really something that you and Kyogen shared, right? There was something substantial, something important and powerful that the two of you shared. So if you had to kind of sum up the object, as it were, of your friendship with Kyogen, like the thing that occupied your shared attention, the thing that you would say maybe you two were looking at together or that you saw together, what would that thing be?
Well, I think that one of the key elements is that we really sought to inhabit our traditions in order to see one another as clearly as possible. So it wasn't that we were fixated on one another, but we really wanted to share space together to, use the language as I do in the book of going in search of a global humanity to really account for fellow travelers well. And in this case, it'd be Kyogen and Kyogen doing the same with me. So it's really seeking to account for the other well rather than to project. I think that's one of the key aspects of our work together, namely to see the other and to account for the other as they are, and in some respects, as they would want to be seen, to really try and enter in to their story and their life as best as one can,
Hmm.
while certainly maintaining the distinctiveness.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, so one thing I like to do for all of our guests as we wrap up the episode is to give you a chance to share about any projects that you have in progress, anything you'd like to plug here. I know you mentioned a book with IVP Academic, I think that you're working on. So if you'd like to share more about that, you're welcome to do so, or anything else that you'd like to plug. And then second question would be, where can listeners find you, maybe online or otherwise, and maybe learn more about your work?
Great, thank you, Zach. And so I'm working on a few books right now. One is this book for IVP Academic, engaging faith traditions, the classic traditions, many of which are associated with the axial period that Jaspers talked about. And so engaging many of them bound up with our secular age and what can we learn from these various traditions today. And so, I'll be engaging the Hindu tradition and the path of the Buddha and Confucius and a variety of other traditions that occurred. Many of them occurred during the axial era, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm finding that a fascinating journey. I'll be dealing with the Bhagavad Gita, and it's fascinating how Oppenheimer and Gandhi, contemporaries, had very different approaches to understanding the Gita. But a fascinating
Mm-hmm.
book. It's had a huge impact on scholars and practitioners of throughout the ages, and you know other traditions as well, from Taoism, as it's called.
Mm-hmm.
And Thomas Merton was a great explorer of that tradition. And so, what can we as Christians learn from these traditions? What do we have to contribute in our particular context in this secular age, as Charles Taylor talks about? So he's certainly going to play a pivotal role in this book, as are these traditions. And so I've got a long time to work on it. I'm working on it daily, but that's key. I'm also working on a book that was part of. It was really emerged from lectures I gave at Trinity School of Ministry a few years ago for the Robert Weber Center
Mm-hmm.
there, and the lectureship I gave, and it was really about suffering, trauma, and resilience, accounting for the book of Hebrews in this regard, but also what does that mean for us today as we deal with suffering and trauma, and how to cultivate resilience. And it's a book for Cascade, and it'll be part of this series, Worship and Witness series. And I've written for that series before, with the book on the liturgical calendar, setting the spiritual clock, and that's for a series done by the good people of the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. So those are two books I'm working on. Other writing projects including one on our story with Christopher, our journey involving his traumatic brain injury and our pursuit of meaningful recovery for him and for ourselves. So
Mhm.
that's an ongoing project. If someone wants to find out more about my work, I do a lot of writing related to Christopher, even on Facebook, my Facebook account. But I do have a website that I need to update significantly because I just haven't, with Christopher's situation, been able to update
Mhm.
like I would
Mhm.
like. But it's paullewismetzger.com. There are two L's, Paul Lewis, so the two L's are there, paullewismetzger.com. And it lists many of my blog posts over the years, not most of the recent ones, but and many of my writing projects, books and the like. And I think there's also my Pathos blog, Uncommon God, Common Good, that
Mhm.
I look forward to getting back into. And then, of course, New Wine, New Wineskins, what we do over there at new-wineskins.org. So those are some of the ways
Mhm.
in which people can connect with my work as they see fit. And of course, Evangelical Zen.
Mhm. Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, we will leave links to all of the things that you mentioned in the show notes, so listeners be sure to check those out. The book again is the second edition of Evangelical Zen: A Christian's Spiritual Travels with a Buddhist Friend. Paul, thank you so much for chatting today. I really enjoyed reading your book. Appreciate you taking some time to talk today.
Zach, it's great to be with you. It's great to actually meet you in person, so to speak. We've
Yeah.
emailed quite a bit, but and we're doing this over technology. But I'm also looking forward to actually literally meeting you in person before
Yes,
too long.
yes.
So
Me as
thank you,
well.
Zach, and
Yeah.
always grateful for you and Whiffenstock and Cascade and the editors I've worked with over the years. They're just my cup is filled with gratitude for you all.
Oh, thank you, Paul. I'll pass that along for sure.